Converting a successful military aircraft into a civil, commercial, or otherwise non-combat oriented role has historically yielded mixed results. The desirable characteristics of military aircraft often differ quite significantly from their civilian counterparts, meaning that a lot of work is often needed to produce a successful conversion, and oftentimes such work is not particularly economical. Military aircraft, after all, are optimized for performance and survivability, not for passenger comfort or fuel efficiency. However, today we'll be looking at a transport aircraft developed from one of the most famous bombers of all time, and one that against most odds went on to enjoy a long and successful service life in both military and civilian hands. And that aircraft is the Avro York. Now, to understand the origins of the Avro York, we need to look at the state of British aerial logistics in the early years of the Second World War. By 1941, it was obvious that a large, modern transport aircraft was urgently needed. Aerial transport, as a formally organized RAF capability, was still in its infancy, and the service relied on a mixed bag of aircraft, facilities, and routes that would only later be consolidated under Transport Command. Up until that point, the RAF had operated a smattering of newer bombers in improvised transport roles, bombers such as the Handley-Page Halifax or the Vickers Wellington, alongside slightly older or obsolescent designs like the Bristol Bombay and the de Havilland Dragon Rapide. These aircraft fulfilled their roles as best as they could, and in many cases with admirable enthusiasm, but most were stopgaps, hurried wartime conversions that lacked the space, the accessibility, and the range expected of a true long-distance transport. As the year dragged on, and as other theatres heated up, particularly in Africa, the need for an improved transport became impossible to ignore. Now, across the Atlantic, the US Army Air Corps had faced a similar logistical challenge, and they had arrived at a near-perfect solution with the C-47. The C-47 was developed from the hugely successful Douglas DC-3. This was ideal for the Army for a number of reasons. It was a mature, tried and tested design. It needed minimal work to convert from civil to military transport duties, and Douglas already had large production facilities, with the means to expand them further. Britain could not take the same approach. Firstly, it had been slower to adopt to monoplane designs in commercial air travel, so there weren't many well-established designs that could be easily converted. Secondly, many British airliners were smaller, or the ones that were big enough were flying boats. Now, these were fine for coastal routes, but a flying boat is not particularly useful for inland operations. And thirdly, almost all British commercial aircraft at the time were being built in relatively small numbers, often using modest production facilities, and this was because most manufacturers had shifted their focus towards military aircraft as early as 1937, or the manufacturer themselves did not have the capital or the available land space to have production lines that rivaled those of their American commercial competitors. Thus, the British could not borrow the American approach of simply converting an airliner into a transport, and while they would place orders for many examples of the Douglas C-47, they still wanted a homegrown solution. This meant they had to look at converting an existing bomber design instead. This would be a more complicated process, but it did mean that they could look at airframes that were considerably larger than that of the C-47. Of these, none was as capable or as modern as the Avro Lancaster, which had taken its first flight at the beginning of 1941. Avro's chief designer, Roy Chadwick, had already recognized the type's potential as a transport, both commercial and for the RAF, and he had planned out a converted design that was known in-house as the Avro Type 685. The design emphasized three things: rapid development, carrying capacity, and, most importantly, the maximum use of existing Lancaster components. This would minimize disruption to Avro's wartime production lines, which was very good as they would become one of the cherished obsessions of Bomber Command's CNC Arthur Harris, a man not known for his zen-like patience. As a result, the Avro 685 retained the wing, the tail surfaces, the landing gear, and the power plants of the Lancaster bomber. There was one key change. The 685 would require a completely new fuselage, and Chadwick adopted a square section design that dramatically increased internal volume compared with the bomber's original layout. The redesigned fuselage also allowed the wing to be shoulder-mounted. This eliminated spar intrusion into the cabin, created a more accessible and uninterrupted internal space, and improved low-speed stability, which was a quality that was considered essential for this design, as it would sometimes be operating on short and rough airstrips, and often with heavy transport loads. Design work moved along quickly. By February 1942, the internal drawings for the new design had been completed and passed on to Avro's experimental department, where the internal layout, the cabin structure, and the general arrangement of the internal systems were refined before the prototype was approved for assembly. The amended design was then submitted by Chadwick to the British Air Ministry, who immediately delivered bad news that almost torpedoed the entire aircraft's development. An agreement was being drafted between Britain and the United States that dictated the allocation of aircraft production for the war. Britain was to focus on the production of combat aircraft only, and America would handle the production of all transport aircraft that Britain required. Now, this made sense as it would allow Britain's already overstretched industry to solely focus on military aircraft, particularly heavy bombers, and with the new Lend-Lease agreement, it would have an ample supply of transports like the Douglas C-47. However, this Anglo-American agreement was not yet formalized, nor would it ever come into effect as an absolute hard rule, and the Air Ministry didn't want to stop all domestic transport developments. Not only was the Avro 685 a comparatively cheap design, but even in the dark year of 1942, the Air Ministry was looking forward and considering the future of air transport in a post-war world, and it was highly reluctant to rely solely on foreign-designed aircraft. Additionally, the Avro 685 was a much larger transport design compared to things like the Douglas C-47, which had its own advantages, and its longer range was far more suitable for the peacetime logistical needs of the British Empire. As a result, and after a bit of internal wrangling behind closed doors, the Air Ministry finally gave Avro permission to produce a prototype. This aircraft, which was given the serial number LV626, was completed in just a few months, and it made its maiden flight on the 5th of July 1942. Despite being largely a proof-of-concept airframe, LV626 demonstrated that the fundamental design was promising. Test pilots reported that the prototype had generally stable handling, excellent lift characteristics, and a generous reserve of power. Encouraged by these early results, the Air Ministry authorized 2 additional prototypes, followed by a small batch of production aircraft. The type was given the official designation of Avro 685 York, and this was formalized under Air Ministry specification C1/42. LV626 continued its evaluations and performed well overall, but one issue gradually did emerge, and this was a lack of directional stability. The unchanged twin-fin tail from the far slimmer Lancaster did not provide sufficient control authority for the larger, bulkier, and more slab-sided airframe. Beginning with the third prototype, this issue was resolved by enlarging the existing fins and adding a third central fin, a configuration that markedly improved stability and was adopted on all subsequent Avro Yorks. While LV626 was transferred to RAF Boscombe Down for further trials, the remaining prototypes and some early production aircraft were used to test and explore various configurations. The first production aircraft featured large ventral cargo doors, which was intended for potential paratrooper use. This was a role that initially seemed promising, but later testing showed issues with the slipstream pulling the parachutes dangerously close to the tailwheel assembly, or, with secondary doors used, the tail assembly in general. Enthusiasm for the idea of using the York for paratrooper use diminished quite rapidly, and sources seem to differ for the exact reason why. It seems that changes could have been made to the York to make it perfectly suitable for paratrooper use, but these were never fully explored. Rather than hypothesize on why this wasn't done, I'm just going to leave it aside and use this as a touch point for a later video that I want to work on that covers the development of British paratrooper operations in the war in general. As part of the early testing phase, Avro also explored alternative power plants, and the first prototype would be later re-equipped with Bristol Hercules radial engines in place of its Rolls-Royce Merlins. The Hercules installation performed reasonably well, and it offered a potential insurance against shortages of Merlin engines, and the air-cooled nature of the Hercules engine had its own advantages, particularly with resistance to battle damage. But apparently these advantages were not compelling enough to justify a redesign. As a result, LV-626 would be the only Avro York to fly with radial engines, which, from an aesthetics perspective, I find to be a bit of a shame because I thought it actually looked quite nice with the chunky radials in place of the Merlins, though of course to some people that probably will come across as heretical to say. Now, with any major issues of the prototyping phase resolved, or at least resolved to the level that satisfied both Avro and the test pilots, the York's production configuration had finally taken shape. The aircraft measured 78 feet 6 inches in length, with a wingspan of 102 feet and a height of 16 feet 6 inches. Although the wings, landing gear, and much of the internal structure were carried directly from the Lancaster, the York's entirely new fuselage had dramatically increased usable space, more than doubling the internal volume of its bomber predecessor. As is evident to anyone with a pair of functioning eyes, this was not achieved through any feat of advanced redesign, but simply by making the fuselage an unapologetically large box. The new fuselage followed the same all-metal stressed skin construction of the preceding Lancaster, built around light alloy frames and stringers with duralumin skin. Inside, the cabin could be configured for freight, troop transport, or airline-style passenger accommodation, helped by a wide cargo hatch and a long, unobstructed cabin floor. A standard crew of 5 would operate the aircraft, which had an empty weight of just over 42,000 pounds, a normal loaded weight of around 65,000 pounds, and a maximum takeoff weight of approximately 72,000 pounds. Sources do differ. The redesigned cockpit, with its side-by-side controls and forward position in the nose, gave crews an excellent field of view. Power came, of course, from 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, inherited from the Lancaster design. Now, initially, these were Merlin 24s, supposedly, producing approximately 1,280 horsepower each. Later, the York would use a variety of civil and military versions of the Merlin, sources conflict on the exact list, with power outputs ranging from between 1,150 and 1,680 horsepower per engine. Driving 3-blade constant-speed full-feather propellers, these engines gave the aircraft a top speed of about 300 miles per hour at altitude, and it commonly cruised at speeds of between 200 and 215 miles per hour during long-range operations. 7 wing tanks provided a combined fuel capacity of 2,478 gallons, giving the York a practical range of about 2,700 miles depending on load. In its production form, the York could carry up to 56 fully equipped soldiers, or roughly 7.5 tons of freight, giving it the capacity and flexibility expected of a genuine long-range transport of its era. On paper, it was a highly capable aircraft, but getting it into production in meaningful numbers during wartime would be another challenge entirely. Almost immediately, the Avro York ran into difficulties. Production was agonizingly slow to begin with. The aircraft relied on several major components taken straight from the RAF's most in-demand bomber at the height of the war, and the Lancaster always took priority on the assembly line. This was further compounded by the steady stream of transports that were beginning to be delivered by the United States. In practice, this meant that the York spent much of its early life waiting politely in line behind its more famous sibling for key components, watching said key components drift back towards the bomber production lines whenever the hint of a shortage was mentioned. As a result, and despite the Air Ministry's growing enthusiasm for the new transport, the Avro York was assigned a pitifully low production priority. By the end of 1943, more than 12 months after the first 4 aircraft had completed their flight testing, only 3 additional airframes had been finished, even as plans had optimistically projected that output would rise to 3 per month in 1944. However, even with these delays, a handful of the early Avro Yorks still found important roles. In March 1943, LV-633, the third prototype, was delivered to No. 24 Squadron, which was the RAF's dedicated VIP transport unit. Later given the name of Ascalon, it became the personal transport of Britain's wartime leadership, and it was soon joined by 2 early production Yorks, which were serialed MW-100 and MW-101. These aircraft flew a remarkable number of long-range missions, carrying members of the British cabinet, chiefs of staff, and senior military planners to conferences and inspection tours across the Middle East, the Mediterranean, and even into the Soviet Union. Winston Churchill made extensive use of Ascalon during the war, and did not take his final flight in the aircraft until October 1944 after returning from a diplomatic mission to Moscow. After the war, Ascalon continued serving for a considerable time, operating throughout the Far East until 1954, when it was replaced by another York, which was then named Ascalon II. This successor would eventually become the last York to see operations in RAF service, and it wasn't struck off charge until March of 1957. Now, as a side note here, the original Ascalon was also intended to feature a rather unusual innovation, a pressurized Perspex egg compartment inside the fuselage, designed so that VIP passengers would not need to wear oxygen masks at high altitudes. It would have included a telephone, drinking facilities, and an ashtray, essentially a self-contained pressure pod for Winston Churchill that was several years ahead of its time. Although the concept was successfully tested on the ground and even received official approval, it was never equipped to the aircraft in service, as Avro was, by this stage, shifting its development priorities towards work on the new Avro Lincoln. Meanwhile, the founding of RAF Transport Command in March 1943 formally organised Britain's long-range air transport operations, and the York quickly became central to its plans. Transport Command quickly placed a major production order for 200 Avro Yorks, with another 100 authorised later on. As production finally accelerated in 1944, most Yorks were built as passenger transports, while a smaller number were completed as dedicated freighters fitted with strengthened floors and widened cargo doors. Now at this point, it's interesting to note that despite the RAF's pressing need for transports, and despite the fact that it had requisitioned pretty much every civil transport of size that it could get its mitts on, the British Overseas Airways Corporation, BOAC, managed to secure an allocation of 5 Avro Yorks in April 1944, and a further 25 at the end of the war. With 30 aircraft on hand, BOAC became the world's largest civil operator of the York in the post-war era. But, winding the clock back a little bit, the beginning of April 1944 saw the first York enter service on regular BOAC routes between the United Kingdom, Morocco, and Cairo. As more aircraft arrived, Yorks began appearing on longer and more demanding services to Johannesburg and Durban, and BOAC crews soon found themselves flying the type across Africa, the Middle East, and the Indian Ocean. These flights carried a variety of passengers, diplomatic mail, high-priority freight, and occasionally even medical evacuations. The York proved sufficiently reliable to remain in passenger service until either 1950 or 1952, sources differ, and it continued in BOAC's freighter fleet until 1957. Once retired from passenger duties, the majority of BOAC's Yorks were sold off, with around 21 going to the Lancashire Aircraft Corporation. There, they entered a surprisingly active second career, flying long-distance military trooping flights to the Suez Canal zone in the early 1950s. Now, BOAC was not the only airline to operate the York. British South American Airways operated the second largest civilian fleet, with 12 aircraft in service. Their time with the type was short-lived, however. Confusingly, BSAA was absorbed into BOAC in July of 1949, and its Yorks became surplus, eventually dispersing into secondary operators or put into storage. An equally brief but notable period of service was also seen with the Argentine airline FAMA, which ordered 3 Yorks for its transatlantic route between South America and Spain. Intended to modernize the airline's long-range operations, the York's spacious cabin and high payload capacity made it an appealing, if slightly unconventional option. Shortly after taking delivery of its first 3, the airline ordered 2 additional aircraft, which, depending on sources, were delivered either 9 or 18 months later. Overall, the type was popular. It was spacious, it was considered easy to fly, and it was a significant upgrade in terms of passenger capacity compared to previous transports operated by FAMA. The only major complaint was noise. The York did not have the best sound insulation. Indeed, there was almost no difference between the insulation on the freight-carrying version and the passenger-carrying version, meaning that you had to shout to be heard by the person pretty much sitting next to you. From a passenger perspective, though, this was the only major complaint, and the York was praised for its size and convenience far more than it was criticized for its loudness. However, FAMA suffered a major setback on the 23rd of December 1946, when one York, encountering poor weather and visibility on descent, crashed into the mountainous terrain surrounding Rio de Janeiro with the loss of all 21 aboard. The remaining aircraft only continued operating until 1951, at which point they were sold back to Britain owing to, and I quote, operational difficulties. Now, most of these difficulties stemmed not from the aircraft itself, but from the severe weather systems, atmospheric turbulence, and the limited navigational infrastructure of the South Atlantic corridor. However, it must be said that the York's accident record was far from ideal, something that definitely influenced its commercial prospects in some regions. In fact, far from ideal may be the politest possible way of describing an accident rate that was upwards of 1/3 of total production. Of the 257 or 258 aircraft that were built, 87 were lost in accidents, though not all of them fatal. Many of these incidents occurred in unforgiving environments, high-altitude aerodromes with thin air, tropical regions prone to violent weather, or improvised post-war runways with uneven surfaces. The York's large frontal area and relatively modest single-engine performance demanded careful handling during takeoff and climb, and pilots operating in poor weather or mountainous terrain often had little margin for error. These factors made the York a capable but demanding aircraft, regardless of whether it wore civil or military markings, and because of this it was less suited to more exotic locations compared to some of its contemporaries. But despite its unsuitability for being operated in certain climatic conditions, the York would find itself being operated in some incredibly difficult environments. Most notably, in 1954, 12 Avro Yorks were sent to Canada, where they were operated by Maritime Central Airways, Arctic Wings, Pacific Western, and Transair during construction of the DEW line. This was a vast chain of radar stations in the high Arctic, which were designed to provide early warning of Soviet bombers during the Cold War. These operations were among the harshest that the Avro York was ever operated in. Aircraft routinely battled sub-zero temperatures, whiteout conditions, and primitive landing strips that were just carved into the frozen tundra. Navigational aids were few or non-existent, maintenance facilities were rudimentary and often completely snowed in, and crosswinds were fierce enough that on multiple occasions the wide-track undercarriage was not enough to keep the aircraft stable during takeoff or landing. At least 4 of the 12 aircraft were lost or severely damaged during the operation. Of the survivors, some returned to Britain, while others remained in Canadian service, most notably with Transair, which reportedly operated one York as late as 1961. In commercial service, the final Yorks operated by Britain carried on flying until the mid-1960s. Many of these were ex-RAF transports, but a few were ordered as commercial aircraft by the independent airline Skyways, which was the only other entity to order the York in its commercial configuration. By the end of its airline career, the York had been operated by BOAC, Skyways, and a string of transport and charter companies. The last operator of the York, Dan Air Limited, didn't retire its final aircraft until 1964. Unfortunately, because being used as a transport is often a necessary but thankless task, the York's military career isn't as well documented. In military service, the York's main contribution during the Second World War, beyond moving VIPs around, was in supporting RAF Transport Command on its long-distance routes, particularly those linking Britain with the Middle East, India, West Africa, and Australia. By 1945, No. 511 Squadron became the first unit to be equipped entirely with Yorks, and by 1948 a total of 10 squadrons within Transport Command were wholly or partly operating the type. That same year, a VIP York was presented for the use of General de Gaulle, who flew it during his August visit to Washington, and later on in 1954 or 1955, the French Navy acquired 2 Yorks for personnel and liaison duties. Ironically, the RAF's last major employment of the York, whose predecessor was used relentlessly to bomb the German capital of Berlin from 1943 to 1945, was to supply aid to that very same city just a few years later. Following the Soviet blockade of Western-controlled Berlin sectors, the Avro York saw major involvement in Operation Vittles, which today is more commonly known as the Berlin Airlift. From June 1948 to May 1949, 7 operational York squadrons flew around 29,000 return flights into Berlin airfields, delivering approximately 230,000 tons of cargo. From June 1948 to May 1949, 7 operational Avro York squadrons flew around 29,000 return flights into Berlin airfields, delivering approximately 230,000 tons of cargo. In the early stages of the operation, the York often carried high-priority loads, such as powdered food, medical supplies, and essential equipment, making full use of its square-section fuselage and wide cargo door. Its combination of long-range and heavy-lift capability made it particularly valuable before the arrival of the larger Handley-Page Hastings, and at the peak of the airlift, Avro Yorks were landing in Berlin at intervals of only a few minutes. The airlift marked the York's final major contribution in RAF service. By the end of the operation, many aircraft were showing clear signs of fatigue and corrosion. Unsurprising after years of wartime service followed by sustained round-the-clock flying in harsh winter conditions over occupied Germany. Once the blockade ended, a number of surviving Yorks were sold on to private operators, while others were withdrawn from use and scrapped or broken down for spare parts, their airframes having reached the limits of economical refurbishments. The story of the York in general is rather interesting. Designed as something more akin to a stopgap, it nevertheless enjoyed a service life of more than 20 years, and it concluded its military career on a notably uplifting note, helping sustain the people of Berlin, even though many had once feared the sound of the very same engines on the very same wings. Despite its high accident rates, the aircraft's worst day-to-day characteristic was the incredibly loud ride it offered its passengers, who would sit only feet away from 4 very loud Merlin engines with minimal insulation to soften the noise. Yet, for all of its quirks and its limitations, the York proved adaptable, dependable, and capable of the tasks few wartime designs could have handled as effectively. Although none remain airworthy today, at least two complete examples still survive, one on display at the RAF Museum in Cosford, and the other at the Imperial War Museum at Duxford. As always, thank you all so much for watching. And a big thank you, of course, to the Patreon supporters and YouTube members who help keep this channel going. Now, this coming weekend, I am moving house again. I know it sounds like I'm moving house a lot, because I am, but thankfully this only is a small move, so I should have the office set up and running again in relatively short order. Long story short, there has been an endless drama with the current property that we've been renting, to the point where we've taken the letting agency to the tribunal here, and with the constant noise from loud construction right outside the office windows, a change of scene has been absolutely required. A big thank you, of course, to our Wing Commander tier supporters, our highest tier members, and a warm welcome to Typhoon Man, who is the newest member of this special group. The polls for this month have wrapped up, with future video priorities now locked in, and I'm already working on the next set for February, so please stay tuned. If you've got any questions, feel free to drop them down in the pinned comment below, and if you're new here and you like what you see, please consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one, and so that YouTube knows to promote genuine creators on this platform, and not the horrific flood of low-effort AI slop that we're currently being forced to deal with. But anyway, that is all from me today. Thank you all so much for your continued support, and I'll catch you all next time. Goodbye.